Okay, to begin our discussion of the Great Depression, we're going to go through the causes, or possible causes of the Depression, and there are approximately 8. We're going to discuss 4 in this lecture. Herbert Hoover is quoted as saying in his memoirs, quote, "In the large sense, the primary cause of the Great Depression was the war of 1914 to 1918. And in a sense, this was true. The international debt structure that resulted from the war exacerbated and to some degree caused the Great Depression. After the war, U.S. allies owed the U.S. Huge amounts of money. You'll recall we supplied Britain and France with all these materials. Well, they had to owe us. They had to pay us for that. That's one of the reasons they argued for heavy reparations by the Germans. In the 1920s, 1924 particularly, Germany couldn't pay. The reparations were too big. And a U.S. banker named Charles Dawes stepped in and negotiated a deal whereby the U.S. would make loans to Germans. This would be good to help reinvest and rebuild their economy, who would then get reduced reparations, and they could make those. This was a threat of the potential war again, and so Dawes solved this and won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he became Calvin Coolidge's vice president we see here. This is what the Dawes plan looked like. The U.S. would loan money to German and Austrian banks. They could then make their reparations payments to the Allies, who of course would use the money to pay back the U.S. So it was all a big circle. This credit line was devastated after 1929 when U.S. banks were no longer able to do that. German and Austrian banks suffered a panic. One way to relieve them would have been to ease, suspend, or renegotiate obligations owed by Britain and France to the U.S., and Wall Street wanted this. Hoover wanted this. It was the right thing to do, but there was this very isolationist, anti-Wall Street sentiment that made that not possible. So therefore, the post-World War I debt structure was a major cause of the destabilization of the European economy in the late 1920s. Remember, the Great Depression was a global event. Cause number 2, an unequal distribution of wealth that arose during the 1920s. It stymied economic recovery. Although average income rose in the 1920s, the incomes of the wealthier grew at a higher rate. Between 1918 and 1929, the share of income that went to the wealthiest 20% rose by 10%, while the share that went to the poorest 60% fell by 13%. Part of this was the result of the Coolidge administration. Now, I'm skipping over the history of the 1920s. We have a series of Republican presidents, Warren G. Harding first from 1921 to 23. He's kind of an idiot. And he died in office, and he was succeeded by his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, who also was elected in his own right, served to 28. The Coolidge administration contributed to this problem by lowering taxes on the wealthy, which increased the proportion of wealth in their hands. The problem with that is that deepening inequality curtailed consumption. It was in the 1920s the U.S. became a mostly consumer-oriented economy. And even when the rich spent lavishly, they were spending a smaller proportion of total incomes on consumption than did consumers. Consumers did not have as much money. So we were putting more of the total increase in national income in the hands of consumers would have strengthened the economy, making the bounce back from 1929 more likely. Therefore, this unequal distribution of wealth due to the tax policies of the Coolidge administration, there's a storm outside, was also a major cause. In class, remind me to tell you about the issue of tax progressivity. Cause number 3, overcapacity. These two gentlemen here were the Fed chairmen during the 1920s. The Federal Reserve Bank kept the money supply high and interest rates low during the 1920s. And some theorize that this Fed's easy credit policies of the 1920s contributed to both the stock market bubble and the overexpansion of capacity by industry. How? Well, if interest rates are low, I'm going to go borrow money to buy stocks, driving those stock prices higher than perhaps the earnings of the company justified. And if interest rates are low, I'm going to borrow money to build factories, even though see cause number 2, consumers are somewhat weakened and they don't have enough income to buy all the stuff those new factories can build. So factories expanded rather dramatically beyond what the American consumer could buy. Two famous economists of the 1920s, Catchings and Foster, espoused a theory that influenced many, including Herbert Hoover. It held that the economy produced more than it consumed because consumers did not have income, this very thing I'm just talked about. Therefore, wages increased at a rate less than productivity increases. Industry is becoming more productive, but wages are increasing at a slower rate, and most of the increased productivity went into profit, increasing the stock market bubble instead of consumer spending. As long as business continued to expand their capital, their factories and equipment, the economy had flourished. Under pressure from Calvin Coolidge and business, the business community, the Fed kept rates low, encouraging high, even excessive amounts of investment. By the end of the 1920s, investment had created more capacity than could be used profitably, and business was producing more than consumers could buy. Therefore, overinvestment in industrial capacity compared to wages and earnings from independent businesses like farms created a problem. The solution was for government to put money into consumers' pockets to redistribute purchasing power to consumers. The economy was overbuilt, so Catchings and Foster recommended large construction projects to hire people and put money in their pockets. That's something that both Herbert Hoover and FDR did, and it's now kind of common knowledge. It was kind of a new idea at the time. But frankly, what they did was not enough to overcome this incredible mismatch between consumers' ability and the capacity. Cause number 4, deflation. The gold standard theory of the Great Depression attributes it to the post-war deflationary policies. Now, this is not unlike what happened in the Gilded Age in America. You'll recall that to finance the Civil War, the U.S. had to print money. And after the war was over, it was believed they had to kind of suck this printed money, this non-gold-backed money, out of the economy, the greenbacks. This led to the deflationary policies of the Great Depression, which farmers and the populace so hated. Same thing in World War II. The Allies printed money. And after the war, they thought, well, we got to fix this. Got to go back to the gold standard. Inflation was feared greatly, especially in the Weimar Republic of Germany. You see kids playing with Deutschmarks there because that amount of Deutschmarks wouldn't buy that amount of blocks. The value just collapsed from superinflation. And so the gold standard was put back. Creditors liked the pre-war price levels. Why? They wanted creditors, bankers, benefit from deflationary policies. Britain passed the British Banking Act of 1925. It put the pound sterling at a parity with the pre-war price. We're trying to get this paper money out of the system. But of course, that creates deflation. And deflation's impact is particularly hard on sectors of the economy that regularly use credit to finance activities like agriculture. Deflation erodes commodity prices. Prices fall while increasing the real value of debt. It benefits bankers. Therefore, the interwar gold standard magnified the initial shock and was a significant obstacle to any actions that would ameliorate the growing depression. The depression hit. The thing to do was to increase the money supply, to stimulate the economy. This gold standard had been put in place in the 20s. Made that hard. Some countries did abandon the gold standard during the Depression pretty early and ultimately suffered less. The U.S. did not.